Welcome to Soul Night Live episode number 95, The History of King Crimson, Part 1, with Henry Potts and Aymeric Leroy. Welcome back. It's good to see you, gentlemen.
Nice to be
So
back.
King Crimson, it's another group that's close to our hearts, and I was curious how each of you came to know their music briefly. Henry, how about you?
So I got into Rush and Yes in the 80s, like many people did, and through those I discovered Asia, and then I was like, oh, John Wetton, he was in this other band. Presumably it's similar. Turns out it's not, but I still fell in love with the music. Couple of albums took me a bit of time to get used to right at the beginning, but yeah, I think it's those connections with Yes, with other prog bands just led me straight to King Crimson, and I've enjoyed their music very much since.
Excellent. And Aymeric, how about you?
Well, the first time I heard King Crimson was in the very room I am in right now.
Wow.
So it's quite a memory because I had this neighbor who was about 20 years older than I was, so it was in the late 80s, and she wanted to revisit her own past and asked me to borrow albums from the local library and albums that I knew nothing about. And one of those albums was King Crimson. So before I gave it to her, I gave it a listen. And I have this distinct memory of hearing the first Crimson album, Schizoid Man, and then I Talk to the Wind. And it was, I remember lying on the floor in the dark because it seemed the best way to enjoy the music. And it was really a striking memory. So that's the first Crimson I heard, although it was 20 years old at the time, and I knew nothing of what had happened more recently, like the 80s incarnation or anything. So
Did you then explore King Crimson chronologically? Did you work your way through?
I guess a compilation called the Compact King Crimson had just come out, but the CD version only had stuff from the first album and stuff from the 80s. So I quickly got to know that period. But in the meantime, I was borrowing other albums from the library and came to know the all the 70s stuff. I mean, mostly the Wetton era, but some albums were still difficult to find. So it took a while in those days. You didn't just download the whole discography from the internet.
Yeah, well, preferably you'll just buy it, but
Yeah,
it's out there.
yeah.
Yeah.
I've got all the box sets.
Yeah, I think we've all bought these albums for real more than once.
Yeah.
With all the remasters that came out in the 90s. Yeah, definitely. For me, you know, uh, it took a while to run across King Crimson. I don't even remember the first time I heard of them. I think because they didn't play them on TV here in the States, or I probably would have run across them in the early 80s. But unlike Yes and Rush and groups like that were pretty predominant on MTV, obviously King Crimson wasn't, because while they did have an 80s reinvention, reborn in the 80s, it was, it's never very commercial, if commercial at all. And while I can point to a couple songs that came along later that could kind of qualify, as a rule, it really wasn't the kind of stuff you were going to see on MTV or here on American radio. So I didn't really seriously get into them until probably the early 90s. A friend of mine loaned me a copy of Discipline, and I loved it. It was very exotic sounding to my ears. And right around that time, Thrack came out. And I remember I was just buying something else at the record store one day, and there was a stack of them by the register, and I was like, toss that in my bag. And when I got home, I was like, wow, this does not sound like Discipline. This is heavy and kind of brutal. And I loved it because I was really into heavy music at the time anyway. And it was like an intelligent version of that, if that makes sense. So anyhow, all these years later, yeah, I mean, they definitely made my life better with their amazing eclectic music. So I thought it'd be great to spend some time and kind of talk about their roots, which is a story that's been told many times before. So it's not like we're exactly, unearthing anything that isn't already out there. But this is our way of saying it. So we're going to go ahead and get rolling. I have a little slideshow to work with this, although I'm going to try and not lean on it too much, like kind of show you the album we're talking about, and then I'm going to put it away and we're going to talk about it, and then I'll show you the next one. So
I think, though it's a story that's been told many times, I think King Crimson is the band where Robert Fripp has been very successful in almost mythologizing a lot of the band's history, and in crafting one version of the band's history. So I think there are many histories to be told of King Crimson, many of which sort of don't often get surfaced in the same way, because Fripp has been much more successful than you see with a Yes or a Genesis or some of these contemporaries at getting people to believe his version of events.
That's true. Well, there are many different angles you can approach it at, depending on who you are, and being the cornerstone of it, I'm certain he has his own angle as well. I mean, I haven't really heard radically different angles from different people, and I don't think we're going to unearth any today or anything. So if you're looking for dirt, folks, scoot down the dial over at YouTube. There's a lot of folks that specialize in that, with scandalous titles on their videos. The deep, dark secrets of King Crimson. Not going to get them here. Sorry, folks. But the history, yeah, we can help you with that. So let me go ahead and get started. And I guess we should preface all of this by what was going on musically in England at the time, and some of the groups that led to King Crimson. Aymeric, you want to fill us in on a bit of that?
Well, there's two aspects to that. It's what the guys who formed King Crimson were doing before King Crimson, and what the scene was like around them when they started out. And that's two quite different things. Because in many ways, Giles and Fripp, which was the early band with Robert Fripp and Michael Giles, and latterly Ian MacDonald, just before it became King Crimson, was a band whose album released at the time really didn't predate King Crimson musically in a very striking way, apart from maybe a couple of tracks at the end. So that's quite an odd group for its time. I mean, the album is a mixture of almost comedy pop and some sophisticated music, but not really prog in the way that King Crimson was later on. There's already some quite agile guitar work by Fripp on a couple of tracks. There's a track called Suite Number 1, which has a guitar that sounds a bit like Fracture later on, with that really high-speed pick playing. So that's really an odd album. There's another album which we're probably going to discuss later on, that is the Bronsbury Tapes, which is demos by Giles and Fripp, and that's more of the transitional period between the two, and Ian MacDonald is on a lot of it, and some tracks being played were later done by Crimson, and it's beginning to sound like them. So it's really an oddity, that band, Giles and Fripp. It was a complete commercial failure. They just come to London from Bournemouth, trying to make it in London, and didn't really succeed. They never played a single gig under their own name. They got a couple of jobs backing musicians in clubs, but not playing their own music. So they were really desperate towards the end of '68 when they decided to form King Crimson instead. And so that's one aspect. That's one the Giles and Fripp precedent to King Crimson. And then the other side is the scene that was around at the time. And King Crimson are often credited with inventing progressive rock, more or less. It's true in a way because it formalized progressive rock in a way that hadn't been really as strongly asserted. But of course, there's plenty of groups that were already playing something comparable, whether it be the symphonic pop of the Moody Blues, the heavy jazz rock of Colosseum, for instance, and other bands like Procol Harum. Of course, in the States, you had Frank Zappa. So prog wasn't born with King Crimson, but they formalized it in a way that was really striking, and especially but that's stuff for later. But the contrast between tracks like Schizoid Man and I Talk to the Wind, the breadth of material was quite striking. Perhaps
Well, I
Henry
think,
wants to say a bit about the scene at the time.
yeah, so I think the one band you didn't mention, of course, are The Nice with Keith
Yeah.
Emerson. So their second album, Ars Longa Vita Brevis, for example, which is 1968,
Yeah.
I think. You listen to that album, and that is very much a prog album. I mean, you can't hear it as anything other than a prog album. So yes, this characterization of In the Court of the Crimson King as the first prog album is nonsense. It wasn't. But I'm reminded of Churchill's comment about the Battle of El Alamein. Churchill said when that battle was won, this is not the end. This is not even the beginning of the end. It is perhaps the end of the beginning. And that's kind of how I think you can think about In the Court of the Crimson King. It's kind of the end of that beginning period of prog. It brings together influences that are already there. But lots of other well-known prog bands had already formed by that time, and some had even released albums. Pink Floyd, yes. Gong had formed, although hadn't released an album yet. But In the Court of the Crimson King sort of crystallized what it means to be a prog album, as Aymeric was saying. Although it's still an early prog album, I think when you listen to it, it sounds different to what was to follow in 70, 71, 72, 73.
Yeah, it's an early prog album, and it's an early Crimson album as well, because
Yeah.
It's not Fripp led already. I mean, it's still very much dominated by Ian MacDonald songwriting. So the vocabulary, musical vocabulary used is not as sophisticated as it became even on Poseidon. On the next album, there's already much more sophisticated guitar parts and dissonance, like in the Devil's Triangle, for instance. So it's still proto Crimson in many ways, although it's already strongly asserted as an individual direction.
And it's a very successful album. It's a hugely influential album on many of the other prog bands. I think we view history backwards. That is the nature of history. And the story of King Crimson becomes the story of Robert Fripp. King Crimson becomes Robert Fripp's band. But it wasn't at the beginning Robert Fripp's band. It begins with Fripp joining the Giles Brothers. It mutates with Ian MacDonald joining. And there were sort of 5 people on In the Court of Crimson King. We've got Fripp, we've got Michael Giles on drums, we've got this Ian MacDonald. We've got Peter Sinfield writing lyrics, and we've got Greg Lake singing. And the album is collaborative. All of them are very much inputting. And it's a mistake to view the album as Fripp's King Crimson. It is a King Crimson of 5, all super talented, very important players, who would then fracture and go in different directions. The King Crimson name staying with only one of those pieces.
No pun intended. Fracture. Right. So here we're taking a look at the first lineup. Now, how did they all come together? Yes. Do you know the genesis of their first?
There's this great story about how Giles and Fripp starts, which is that Giles and Giles advertised for a singing keyboard player. And so Robert Fripp turns up. He barely plays keyboard at the time and he can't sing. But they liked him. And so you get Giles and Fripp. And then Ian MacDonald joins Giles and Fripp. And then that morphs into King Crimson. So at some point, Aymeric, you're better at King Crimson history than me. Who comes next?
Well, Greg Lake was an old acquaintance of Fripp from Bournemouth. So he was. They played guitar together. They had the same guitar teacher. And slightly before Greg Lake joined, he was in a band called the Shy Limbs. And Fripp was occasional roadie for them and played guitar on the B-side of their single. The band had Andrew McCulloch on drums. So it was a sort of a, if you like Pete Frame's Family Trees, it's sort of pre-King Crimson in several ways. And so that was in late '68, and that was a fairly recent collaboration for Fripp and Lake when Giles and Fripp found themselves at a dead end. I mean, the album had never really taken off at all, and they were getting discouraged. And Fripp said, as he said a few times afterwards, it's either me or Pete Giles leaving this band and letting Greg Lake in to get a strong vocalist for the future, for a new band, because they thought the band was lacking a strong vocalist. That was its main weakness. So Fripp offered to leave or for Lake to replace Peter Giles, and that was of course what they decided was to keep Fripp and have Greg Lake join on vocals and bass, which was a new instrument for him because he was a guitarist.
It's interesting how Peter just stepped aside and let Greg take it, you know.
Yeah.
Not just anyone would do that, you know, although he was soon back, you know, in the wake of Poseidon. So yeah. In the way, you know, he got there eventually.
Yeah.
So
that's early '69, January '69, and the interesting thing about the original lineup is it lasted exactly a year, starting in January and then folding in December. So the year '69 is really the lifespan of that early lineup. And the photo you showed, which was them sitting in Hyde Park on the day of when they supported the Rolling Stones in July, was their big break in England. Until then, they'd started gigging around April, and immediately came to the attention of their fellow musicians, and they were the hot new group, but still playing the Marquee Club and those kind of venues. But when they played Hyde Park, they played a 40-minute set, which is available and is a really strong, powerful set. And they played much better than the Rolling Stones, incidentally, if you know the film. It's not a particularly good performance by the Stones. So, as legend has it, there was 500,000 people there, and there was an incredible reception at the end of Schizoid Man, and standing ovations and that sort of thing. And from that point on, King Crimson was the hot new band nationally, not just for their fellow musicians. So later that year, they went to the USA, played the Palm Beach Festival, which was another breakthrough for them, and they were on the verge of becoming really successful when the album came out. I think around November, probably. So we're reaching the end of '69, and everything looks set for them to become a really successful band, and then they stop dead in their tracks, as we'll see
But the
on.
album sells very well. It's top 5 in the UK. It charts in the US.
Mm-hmm. Of course, with a very striking cover design by Barry Godber. So perhaps we should talk about what's on the album. I mean, the cover is very striking, but it's of course the Schizoid Man, the subject matter of the first song, and it's very much a song about the madness of the times, and there's echoes of the Vietnam War with allusions to napalm, and yeah, all the craziness of war and the turmoil in the world at the time. So it's quite a, it's not a political album, but it's very much an observation of the society at the time. There's various aspects of the 60s counterculture that are covered in it, like the generation gap in I Talk to the Wind. Epitaph is about the Cold War, basically, nuclear doom, the madness of power and mutual annihilation. And the title track may look like a medieval tale, but it's very much about the constants of power, political power, and how it uses propaganda and represses oppression in any era. So it's very much valid in what it says about the mechanics of mechanisms of oppression. So it's quite an astute album lyrically. So praise to Peter Sinfield, and we'll see that the next few albums also have quite interesting lyrical content, and of course it's musical achievement as well. But it's a complete success in every
You know,
way.
it's interesting that they had an outside lyric writer. You know, the only other group I can think of off the top of my head would be the Grateful Dead with the likes of Robert
Oh,
Hunter.
there's Cream and Procol Harum as well.
That's true.
Cream
That's
and
true.
Pete
Okay.
Brown. Yeah.
And Renaissance.
Well, yeah, later on, yeah, with Betty Thatcher. Yeah.
So it wasn't unheard of. It was just rather rare. Do you have any idea how they connected with Sinfield?
He was a writing partner for Ian MacDonald. They had a band together, and actually they wrote in the Court of the Crimson King as a Bob Dylan like folk song. So it probably sounded very different to what we know. It was before all the arpeggios that Fripp brought to the song. So they started writing songs together, and of course, when songs were needed initially for Giles and Fripp, MacDonald and Sinfield started providing songs for them. There was, of course, I Talk to the Wind, which was already done and recorded by this band, but there's also a song called Under the Sky, which was done on Pete Sinfield's first solo album quite a few years later. So that was the basis of the songwriting towards the end of Giles and Fripp. And of course, that carried over to the New King Crimson. And Sinfield also became the lights operator for the band. He did the light show, and later he famously operated the VCS3 synthesizer, doing all sorts of effects on the vocals and drums. But that's a bit later on.
Yes.
So unlike some lyricists who sort of have a arm's length from the band, Sinfield is very much in there as he's on tour with them. He's very much involved in all the activity.
Yeah.
Well, just a couple thoughts about the album cover. Now, this was a piece of art that was located, and they're like, this would work great for a record. It was already done. It had nothing to do with them initially. Is that correct?
I'm not sure of that. I think they met. He was a friend of Sinfield's, Barry Godber. I think he was a workmate of Sinfield's, and I think they met before. And one day he brought them the artwork, and they were all in awe of it. But I don't think I think it was done for the purpose of this, and I don't know how much of the music you heard. I can't remember. It's probably somewhere in Sid Smith's book, all the detail of that, but it's very much made for this music.
Yeah, I think we should defer to Sid Smith's biography as the King Crimson biography of all of them. So if you have yet to check it out, please do. He revised it a year or two ago, or maybe 5 years now. Time flies. But
No, it's more recent than that.
yeah, I thought so. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it went from this thick to this thick.
Yeah.
So there's a lot more to enjoy. So I encourage anyone that's interested in the history of King Crimson to pick up Sid Smith's excellent history of it. And we'll consider this our own footnote to add to all of this, if you like. our
I
own.
note that we haven't yet even mentioned the name Mellotron. I don't think we have we?
No, not yet. And I think we should because it plays a big role on this record.
Yeah,
And at the time, for folks that don't know, it was basically like an early sampler of sorts where they played pre-recorded tapes.
yeah,
You'd hit a key and you'd get a choir, a vocal choir, maybe a big brass sound or a string sound. These were all sounds that came with the mellotron. And there were times when they even blended the two, because I believe you could turn the knob to go from each sound, and if you got it stuck right between the two, you get a blend of both, which I think actually crops up on some Genesis records. Um,
yeah. And King Crimson had the bigger model, I think, with the larger manual on it. I'm not a specialist of Mellotrons, but I think they had a bigger model than what people usually used on the later on. So perhaps it was possible to play several sounds on it at the same time.
yeah, and this was the sound that made the Moody Blues so popular, because our first record was done with an orchestra, and then it was like, how are we going to recreate this later? And the mellotron was used as well, and then that kind of became the basis of their orchestral sound, despite the fact that they didn't really play with an orchestra again.
Yeah, well, the Days of Future Past was actually a mixture of orchestral sections, and when the band played, it was the mellotron.
There
I
was
mean,
some mellotron in there,
they
yeah.
didn't actually merge with the orchestra. And a point of interest is that the Moody Blues were very interested in King Crimson in the spring of '69 when they first appeared, and there were talks for them to actually be on Threshold, the Moody Blues label, which they were launching at the time. And they had meetings, and they were planning to tour together, and they even started recording an album with Tony Clark, the Moody Blues producer. But that didn't work out because they basically wanted to impose on them the working methods he had with the Moody Blues, which was like overdubbing several layers of acoustic guitar and a very grandiose production, when the band actually needed more of a reflection of their live sound. So they did a few days recording with Tony Clark and then abandoned the sessions, and then forgot about Threshold, and they went their own way, created EG Records, and self-produced their albums with their management, which was EG, John Gayden, and David Enthoven. So they went the self-production route and got signed with Island and later with Atlantic in the USA.
Okay. And I wanted to ask something else, but it's escaping me. Oh, we have a question in the chat room. Is there a recording of the title track? You mentioned that Dylan-esque version of it. Is there a recording of that somewhere?
That's a description I read by either Sinfield or MacDonald, but it's never been heard in that guise. Perhaps thankfully, I don't know.
So that has never surfaced. Okay.
No.
Sorry about that. Right. Well, most every group that was coming up at the time cites King Crimson as an influence. Genesis, Moody Blues, yes. And most of them caught them live very early on and were blown away. I remember the story about Chris Squire and John Anderson seeing one of the shows, and John going, Chris, we got to practice more. We thought we were good, but these guys blow us away. They set the bar very high, and I think that was great for the entire scene in a way, because they brought a level of virtuosity that I don't think was really present in rock music too much. You had your heroes like Jimi Hendrix and such, who was his own sort of virtuoso, but they really raised the bar as to what a rock band could do. It's
they
almost
impressed those
demeaning
people
to
as
just
well.
call it a rock band, but it was. And there's many tales of people seeing them live and just being blown away.
Yeah, well, Hendrix himself was blown away. I mean, you approach Fripp after a gig and then say, Shake my left hand, it's closer to my heart. I think those were the words. And Pete Townsend famously also loved them and thought they were the best new band. And he wrote the press release for the album.
Yeah,
Calling
an
it
uncanny
an uncanny
masterpiece.
masterpiece. That's right.
Yeah,
So
And it's not just about their individual virtuosity. I think the thing that struck many people was their ability as a band to all in synchrony go through these complex musical parts.
now was this the first gig that Greg Lake seriously played bass? Because I know he fancied him more of a guitarist than a
he was a guitarist in the Gods, I think, an early sort of version of Uriah Heep, and the Shy Limbs, which I just mentioned, and The Shame also released a single. So all his early bands were him as a guitarist, and it was only by coincidence that they needed a bass player rather than a guitarist, and that was always a source of frustration, I think, for Greg later on, because he rightly thought he was a very good guitarist, quite virtuosic, in fact, and he always ended up in bands that only rarely needed his guitar playing abilities. But he's, of course, a great acoustic guitarist.
Yeah, he was quite an able bass player too.
Yeah. Although I think the first really great bass player in the band was Wetton. I think they went through a succession of singers who played bass as an adjunct rather than, unlike Wetton, who was at the time he joined King Crimson was really a bass player who was learning to sing or wanted to sing more. The other singers, Haskell and Buzz, were also singers who played bass out of necessity.
Yeah, well, I believe the story is that Fripp taught Boz how to play out of necessity. Is that right?
That's been exaggerated a bit because you'd get the impression that he couldn't play any string instruments, but he actually played guitar. So Fripp taught him the bass parts, and he taught him, I think, how to be a good bass player, which he then put to good use, of course, in Bad Company. But he wasn't completely unable to play a guitar. He had sort of the rudiments.
Certainly, I mean, if you could play the guitar, then that's going to give you
it's not that hard to
hand when it comes time to play the bass. Yes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of famous bass players who began as guitar players and were then asked to switch because their band needed it.
Well, your guitar players were a dime a dozen, but bass players were hard to find. So
Paul McCartney is probably the most famous one. He was really reluctant to play bass because at that time, prior to him and a few others making the bass a more sexy instrument in rock, it was really the instrument no one wanted to play in the band. So he was really reluctant. He even was a drummer in the Beatles for a period rather than becoming a bass player when Stuart Sutcliffe left the band.
So the debut album offers up a bit of a template that I think was followed not slavishly, but for the next few records to some degree. And, you know, and some of the best Crimson albums have these balances, you know, you get your kind of mathy, dexterous pieces like Schizoid Man, but there's also these really regal ballads, you know, like I Talk to the Wind, you know, so there's always balance between, you know, the skronk, the dissonance, and these really regal symphonic moments. And
that contrast is so central to a lot of progressive rock as a genre. Is about pastoral versus electric, fast versus slow, loud versus quiet, as Ed McCann has written about. And yes, you get that very strongly on the first album. You have its pastoral elements from Ian MacDonald, and it all works very effectively. But then you get these next few King Crimson albums, which come out phenomenally quickly. You know, we get a series of albums out in very short succession, presumably partly because that's what bands did at the time, unlike today, where you wait 5 years between albums.
right.
But presumably also because, you know, the band's been hugely successful, the record label wants to sell more albums. But the band is collapsing underneath all of this. It's completely fragmenting.
Well, in a way, the reason why there's so many albums in quick succession is because they've off the road they've broken up. So that's why there's two albums in 1970, because first they do Poseidon, which is basically leftovers from the album they were going to record if they hadn't broken up. And then because they failed to then form a band to promote that album, they immediately go back in the studio and do Lizard. After that, it's more like late '71 when they do Island, so there's more of the usual gap there. But it's true that 1970 was a studio year for King Crimson.
Now, explain a bit about why the first lineup didn't last very long.
Well, primarily it was around the notion that Ian MacDonald and Michael Giles discovered that they really didn't like touring. For Giles, it was really a lifelong belief that he then kept to, because he was never again a member of a band that toured. So he really hated touring, all the traveling, all the waiting around. Ian MacDonald, it was more because he just become a couple with a lady at the time, and he was missing her terribly, and couldn't deal with the loss. So or the absence, more like, and so they've both said that it was perhaps a rushed decision, particularly perhaps in Ian MacDonald's case. But when they ended the tour, they wanted nothing to do with touring anymore for a while. Of course, MacDonald later joined Foreigner and toured quite a bit again, so he liked it. But
now, how much did this first lineup tour, and where and who with?
they never toured Europe, never outside of the UK, except for that US tour that they did. Perhaps there's 1 or 2 dates in Canada, I'm not sure. But North American tour, October to December '69. They played the Fillmores on both coasts. And then they played, as I said, the Palm Beach Festival, a few other appearances like this, supporting more famous bands, and sort of residencies in clubs in cities around the US. But it was a long tour, but it wasn't like they were playing every day. It wasn't that dense. So perhaps they played, I mean, less than 20 gigs in the US, I think.
You know, a common thing that I run across doing these interviews with, the classic prog bands of the time was early on, there really weren't any other groups to pair them with. So they'd get put on, they'd come to America and open for the likes of Black Oak, Arkansas, or something of that caliber. And it's such an odd pairing. You've probably heard stories of Gentle Giant touring with Black Sabbath and how that didn't go over particularly well. There's an famous incident
Hollywood
of a
Bowl
bomb being thrown on stage at the Hollywood Bowl.
Yeah.
Or a rather funny story. And it's just typical. It's like most of these groups, it was many years before they wound up on like-minded bills.
Yeah, I mean, I have to praise Jethro Tull here, because they tend to take opening bands that were kind of similar to them, and they helped them break in the US, like Yes. Later they did that with UK. Curve there, I think, also. So there were instances where that worked, but of course in '69 there weren't any other prog bands to pair them with.
No. So
Oh.
it's going to be an interesting pairing. Yes kind of lucked out touring with Tull. That's a pretty good pairing, but that's the exception rather than the rule.
Yeah.
So anything else to add to the debut record before we move on to the follow-up?
So I think we should move on to this fracturing that then occurs. So MacDonald and Giles don't want to do the touring anymore. They stick together though and go off and do a project. Greg Lake leaves, gets poached by Keith Emerson from The Nice to form, of course, Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Leaving Fripp and Sinfield, there seems to be some consideration of, well, who actually gets King Crimson in all of this? Arguably MacDonald and Giles have as much claim to it as anyone else, but they decide, it should be Fripp and Sinfield to get to be King Crimson.
Well, especially if I may, they ended up having both Lake and Giles on the album,
Yeah.
so it wasn't that like they were continuing on their own immediately. They had a sort of a smooth
So
transition in that way.
so Lake and Giles leave, but then they're brought back to play on the album. So a second album is wanted. They don't obviously then have a bass player or a singer or a drummer, and so Michael Giles is back to play. Peter Giles from Giles, Scholes and Fripp gets involved. There's a new singer, but then Greg Lake is basically brought back as a deal. The deal being that he gets King Crimson's PA system if he sings on the second album.
Yeah, there was a bit of indecision on Lake's part actually around that period, because initially they were going to have another singer on the album, but then Greg Lake sort of returns. It's not clear cut that is because the Nice still have gigs until late March 70. And so Keith Emerson is busy until then, and there seems to have been a bit of indecision on Lake's part whether to stay or not, and then at the end he decided that two members gone was too much, too many gone, and he didn't have he said the band could have carried on. I mean, I could have stayed in the band had either Ian or Mike left, but not both of them. So that's when he loses confidence in the band. But of course, yeah, because Giles and Lake are on the album as guests, it really sounds like the first King Crimson quite a bit, especially since most of the music on there was composed and rehearsed while the original lineup was still together.
You've seen the footage from Tops of the Pops performing Cat Food.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think anyone had even seen that until it surfaced about 5 or 6 years ago. Black and white, and now suddenly there's a color version.
Well, colorized. It's been colorized.
Well, they
It's
did
not
a
an
good
actual.
job
Yeah.
because I've seen color pictures from this, anyway. And yeah, that was, there isn't a lot of footage of this early lineup. The first lineup, we literally get like a minute and a half of Hyde Park, about a verse of Schizoid Man, none of the instrumental fireworks, none of that. Just
Yeah, and even that doesn't have much Crimson on it. Actually, if you look at the footage, a lot of it doesn't actually show Crimson. So it's more like 20 or 30 seconds of King Crimson.
Yeah, it's really a shame, and mostly you just see a crowd and some guy climbing up a light post, trying to get a better view. And so that's frustrating. So when you
especially since there was a film crew on hand to film the Rolling Stones. And actually, I was doing a conference on King Crimson once, and I wanted to show footage of the early band, so I used a lot of footage actually from the Stones film, because you even see Fripp on the side of the stage at one point in the "Give Me Shelter." No, is that the film? I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Anyway, the film of the Rolling Stones Hyde Park concert.
So I think the best capsule of the live version of the original lineup came out in the Epitaph box set. There's been so many box sets since then, but it was one of the very first ones that had archival, an archival release. And it's in pretty good quality, all things considered, considering how long ago it was. It has
almost defining box set as a box set. One of the early releases of the form of trying to make almost everything available, and I remember at the time it seemed so huge because it was 6 discs.
There was a 2-disc version, and there was a more.
Yeah, you had to order the other two because they were like Chesterfield and Plumpton, and the sound quality was deemed too low for the average public. So you got the box with enough room to all 4 discs, but when you bought it, you only have the first 2 with the BBC sessions and the Fillmore East and West material, which was soundboard, unlike the other 2.
Yeah, that sounded.
Somehow my favorite performance on that was still Chesterfield Jazz Club, because the sound was raw and the performance was just there was a sort of clinical feel to the soundboard recording of the Fillmores, I felt at the time, which made the Chesterfield particularly superior. And on the latest box, it's been expanded and remastered, so it sounds a bit better. It's still inferior, but I love the feel of the almost physical sense you get of the
Well,
band performing.
well, it's interesting that how important box sets have become to King Crimson. I mean, every prog band has probably released one or two, but this archival approach to it of getting everything out of the vaults and sharing it is kind of unique to Crimson. And the Epitaph box was like the beginning of, like the tip of the iceberg. And it seems quite modest now compared to some of these, you know,
Well, even before
coffee table.
Epitaph, there was The Great Deceiver, which was
True,
a
yeah, that was kind of like,
92, I think it was 5 years before that, and
yeah,
it was a 4 disc live document of the 73, 74 lineup, and that's probably my favorite of all. I mean, it
yeah,
was
it's absolutely
completely
essential.
blown away when that was released. All the
And
improvs,
and
all that.
now all the releases are 15, 20 disc.
Yeah, there's too much perhaps
Yeah,
now, but at the time it seemed like an incredible quantity of
Yeah.
music to be heard. But of course now we have almost everything they have in their archives that's been released either through box sets or on the net.
yeah, there was a fantastic box a few years ago from 1969 that pretty much put everything out there as if we thought we already had it. There was more, and it's quite a nice collection. I know people that have collected every one of them, and they all sit handsomely next to each other on their bookshelves. So it was, the series. It was a series that was sort of made with each other in mind. So
But
collect them all,
hugely,
folks.
hugely expensive to get them all.
Oh, I can imagine. I imagine
I
a
mean,
lot of wives were really pissed off when these things arrived in the post.
I mean the I sometimes wonder about the amount of albums that aren't bought because King Crimson fans have to spend all their money on all of these box sets.
Well, the Floyd boxes are worse, I think. They take up far more room. They're more expensive per disc, and there's really no justification for them being that huge. I mean, I've got
Sure.
the early Floyd box here on the side, and it takes far too much room. King Crimson, I mean, they're all 36 discs in a box that is quite thin,
Yeah.
relatively speaking.
A comment in the chat room says I'd prefer smaller, less expensive box sets so that I could afford to get them. Well, that makes me think of the one from Yes, the Progeny, or
Progeny.
yeah, you could have the 2 CD greatest hits, best of version, or you could buy the whole box, and that, that's a nice option to have.
And the whole box is obviously keep it by me at all times. The whole box set is only tiny compared to your average King Crimson box set, but I mean it was that size because that's what they had.
Agreed. So the next record, In the Wake of Poseidon, is often called a clone of the debut. And I can see that some songs do seem to have a connection. Pictures of a City is not unlike Schizoid Man, right down to its fancy middle section with the quick bits.
And then the title track, there's an interesting YouTube video where a guy has put Lake's vocal from In the Wake of Poseidon on the backing track for Epitaph, and it works quite well. It's basically the same chords and the same pace, and so.
And we have our tender ballad, Cadence and Cascade, which is not unlike I Talk to the Wind. And then the title track, wasn't that the one where it's basically Mars done up, or
No,
Devil's
it's the
Triangle?
Devil's Triangle. Yeah,
Okay.
the first side fits your description. The second side, for better or worse, is quite unlike the first album. It's got cat food on it, and it's got the Devil's Triangle, which is as you say, Mars done differently because the host estate wouldn't let them record the cover they'd been doing
Right.
in
Because
concert.
the first lineup did it live and just
Yeah, and
admitted it was
they had to
Mars.
put that on the album because MacDonald had left with most of what was going to be the second side, which turned out to be the Birdman suite
Mhm.
on the MacDonald Jives. Although I can't imagine it would have sounded exactly the same done by King Crimson, but it was most of the material intended for the second side.
Yeah, so it really isn't a clone. I mean, kind of maybe half of it is, but that's fine. I think the nice thing is cat food being included because that shows yet another side of Crimson that's really been pretty important. They come across as a very serious band, but there's a lot of humor in there too. And you could, you know, Fripp obviously has a great sense of humor and always has. A lot of
Yeah,
people
and there's a
now
thread of
discovering that with his Sunday um, videos and such with Toya. It's like, wow, I never knew he was such a funny guy. It's like, but if you read interviews, you can tell he's always had a pretty good sense of humor.
yeah,
And, I think that's part of that balance. You have your symphonic pieces, you have your technical pieces, you have your ballad, you have your funny song, which is Cat Food. It kind of showed a humorous side of the group that wasn't present on the first album at all.
yeah.
But if you go back to the cheerful insanity, obviously humor was a big part of things. So it was nice to get it back in the fray. And of course, there's a number of other humorous Crimson songs that are in every decade after that.
Yeah, like Ladies of the Road, all the way up to Prozac blues. So there's some twisted blues along the way, like Ladies of the Road again, and Easy Money is also a strange kind of blues, which is both in four
Well,
four
I
and
think
seven
it's
four, and
interesting. When I saw, the Schizoid band, gosh, 20 years ago with Jacko fronting it and such, which was a great alumni band, they performed, music from these first four records. And of course, it hadn't been done in decades because the current Crimson just wasn't really, they were a forward looking outfit. They weren't about nostalgia on any level, and they weren't really the right lineup to do a lot of those things justice. They didn't have any keyboards or any of that. Um, so it was an interesting time.
And 21st Century Schizo Band, I mean, they were great. Love seeing them with Michael Giles initially live, not really touring because they weren't playing enough gigs to tour, but fantastic to see.
Yeah.
yeah, they
So
did do a live DVD in Japan towards the end of Giles' tenure with the band, and then they toured a bit more when Ian Wallace replaced him.
but there were no shows for the second album because of the fractured nature of the lineup. Is that right?
Yeah, there was almost a tour set up with Traffic. They were going to tour France, I think, and possibly the US. And there was a strange lineup that was going to have Peter Giles and another drummer, the identity of whom was never really revealed. But I think it was going to be the drummer from a band called Webb, who was a friend of Lake's. And I think at one point it was going to be Lake on vocals and perhaps acoustic guitar as on the picture from the Top of the Pops. But that got cancelled, I think, because Greg decided he wanted to form ELP, and that was his definitive departure from the band. And so by the summer, they were already rehearsing towards Lizard, summer of 70, writing a lot of new material for a studio project that was Lizard wasn't going to sound at all like the live band, whereas Poseidon, being carried over from the previous lineup, sounded very much like the first album, as we said. But Lizard turned out to be a completely different beast.
Well, Lizard's its own thing in the catalog. There's really nothing like it. It is still quite symphonic in spots. So I do hear kind of a connection between the first two and Lizard.
Yeah.
But musically, it's a different ball of wax.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about the the change of lineup between Poseidon and Lizard?
Well, the interesting thing is that technically, the band is still basically a quartet, so it does look like the same kind of lineup, but actually the new members are on the same level as the guest musicians, like Keith Tippett on piano. So Keith Tippett was the pianist on Cat Food, and then went on to play on several tracks on Poseidon. So it was a newcomer that would end up playing on the next three albums. Gordon Haskell, sorry, was an old friend of Fripp's. They'd been in bands together, a band called the League of Gentlemen, a name Fripp used again later. So he joined singing the song that Greg Lake hadn't finished for Poseidon, which was Cadence and Cascade. He stayed on, played bass as well. So he was a new member of the band. Mel Collins had played a bit of flute and sax on two tracks of Poseidon, so he ended up joining as well. And Andrew McCulloch ended up becoming the new drummer. We talked about him as a member of the Shy Limbs, one of Greg's early bands. So that became the new lineup. But of course, Lizard was a studio project, really. So a lot of other people ended up taking part in it. So Keith Tippett, as I mentioned, and several musicians from his band, Nick Evans on trombone, Mark Cherrig on cornet, and Robin Miller playing oboe and English horn, and John Anderson singing on one of the tracks. So it's a big affair, a massive sound, and quite puzzling to imagine it being performed, which it never was in a live setting. I don't see how they could have played it as a four-piece. Now they did it best in 2018 when they had an 8-piece lineup with 2 keyboard players. That's when they were able to play the Lizard material, but otherwise just a 4-piece. It's difficult to imagine.
Isn't this a number of people auditioned also for King Crimson? You know, we've talked about the people who got in, but isn't this fear that Elton John
was booked by the management to sing on Poseidon when it looked like Greg wasn't going to join, but Fripp heard Elton's first album and decided he wasn't the right voice. So Elton ended up being paid for no work. And later that year, when Haskell left after Lizard, Brian Ferry was one of the singers who auditioned for the job that eventually went to Boz. And of course, that created the connection between Ferry, EG Records, and Peter Seinfeld, who ended up producing the first Roxy album.
Fripp rejects Ferry for King Crimson, but recommends him to the label.
Yeah, exactly.
Talk about a few highlights from the Lizard album.
So, I mean, Lizard in many ways, I think, is the most King Crimson at its most like the other sometimes better known prog bands. You know, in a way, it's more like a Yes album or a Genesis album than other King Crimson releases. It's more what was becoming a sort of mold for a prog album. It's all Fripp and Sinfield. Fripp and Sinfield are writing it and leading it. There hasn't been time for the others yet to input. It's an album that Fripp did not look back on particularly positively for a long time. But that may be more to do with the chaos of the band rather than the music.
Well, that often colors a perception of a record. I mean, just look at Yes and Union as an example.
Yeah, well, that's
a record, but they won't admit it. Yeah, right.
Yeah, that was management and legal advisors interfering with the creative process. In the case of Lizard, it was more to do with the increasing conflict between Fripp and Sinfield, who hadn't really chosen to be the dual leadership of the band. I mean, Sinfield was MacDonald's friend and brought into the band by Ian MacDonald. So once Ian had left, Fripp found himself composing music for Sinfield's lyrics, and it wasn't a natural partnership. And also there were disagreements on the percentage Sinfield should get. It was getting 40% of their songwriting royalties, whether or not the music had any lyrics actually. And then he wanted to increase that to 50-50. So Fripp began to resent that partnership quite a bit, and also because Fripp was involved in Centipede, the Keith Tippett big band, while Lizard was being mixed. It ended up being mixed primarily by Sinfield, who did all sorts of eccentric decisions that have most of which have been removed from the latest remix by Steven Wilson, like the acceleration of Big Top at the end, or some weird dissonant chords heard in the music. Those have been removed. So Fripp hated the album for a long time until the ability to hear it remixed by Steven Wilson with some of what he hated removed from it sort of reconcile him with the album. But it's really, in many ways, the peak of Pete Sinfield's vision for King Crimson, because it's really driven by the lyrical content and the conceptual arc of the album. In many ways, especially the Lizard Suite, it's almost music set to a concept, a lyrical concept by Sinfield, like Lizard being the story of a battle, of a war. And a lot of the music, even instrumental, is a depiction of the war in music, of the battle of Glass Tears. And so that's really the peak of Sinfield being almost an equal leader of the band with Fripp.
That 50-50 split is and remains standard for pop music, half of the composition, half of the lyrics. But you can see Fripp not feeling that that's appropriate for the music in Crimson is.
Especially, as I said, it was going to be even for the instrumentals. Like Sinfield was going to get half of the royalties for the Sailor's Tale. So that you could understand why Fripp didn't want
I
that.
have a tale here myself.
What's your kitty's name?
This cat is called Faf.
Faf. Okay. Well, Faf is the fourth member of our shows here.
Faf enjoys King Crimson, although he does take objection to Tim Hodgkinson's solo albums.
Apparently, he seems quite happy at the moment.
Yeah.
So,
another highlight of the album, I would say, is Circus.
I was going to mention that.
I have some reservations about whether Gordon Haskell was the right vocalist for Crimson, but I think his voice works well on that track, and the track, of course, is magnificent.
Yeah, the acoustic playing from Robert is some of his finest, I think, and that acoustic element was, something you didn't get much of in Crimson. He played acoustic quite a bit, when he was teaching, but on a Crimson record, there's not a lot of acoustic.
Yeah, there's a theme on Poseidon. There's a bit of acoustic on Fallen Angel on Red, but not that much. You're right.
Not very much at all. No.
But the highlight for me on Circus is Mel Collins' alto saxophone solo on the mellotron.
Here's one that, speaking of mellotron, in the middle of Circus when it goes da do da do da do da do, that's the same da do interval that you get in Dinosaur. I'm a dinosaur. Same one. So
that was noted at the time. I think it's in Sid's book as well.
Oh, really? Well,
Adrian Ballou.
But it's like, okay, I've heard that before. So very cool. Okay, so this lineup, why did it dissolve, and did it tour any? I didn't. I don't think it.
No, it was about to tour. They were rehearsing, but Gordon Haskell was getting increasingly resentful of having to sing Sinfield's lyrics, which he hated. And he was vaguely promised that he would have input on the songwriting front, which didn't seem to be coming. And the last straw for him was being asked to sing Schizoid Man in a key that he was really uncomfortable with. He asked for the key to be changed, which probably is is a pain for a guitarist or any instrumentalist to have to do. But he said, I'm not singing this if you don't change it to another pitch, because I can't sing this. And dispute ensued, and he left there and then, and quickly followed by Andy McCulloch. So pretty soon, Fripp and Mel Collins found themselves on their own, just on the eve of what was going to be King Crimson return to the stage. And so they found themselves again without a functioning lineup, and they wouldn't resume touring until the spring of '71. So that's 18 months basically after they'd the first lineup had dissolved.
Now, how does he go about putting together the Islands lineup?
Well, first they had a drummer. Ian Wallace was flatmates of Andy McCulloch's. Thankfully, they were both living at Keith Emerson's house. Actually, they had rooms. They were renting rooms in Keith Emerson's house. So when McCulloch left, he told Ian Wallace there was a vacant drum stool in King Crimson. So they had the trio. They started rehearsing as a trio, but finding a bass player, especially a bass player who could sing, was a bit of a challenge, to say the least. And so they found bass players. Like one was Rick Kemp, who ended up joining Still Ice Band later on. Another was Dave Ambrose, who was in the Trinity with Brian Auger. And actually it was Dave Ambrose who left his bass lying around in the rehearsal room. And when Buzz Burrell, who was one of the singers with Centipede, so Fripp knew him from Centipede, came to audition as a singer, there was this bass in the basement where they were rehearsing, and he had to try with the bass, and Fripp said, I think I can teach you the bass parts for this. You seem to have a good instinct for playing bass as well as singing. So he thought they could keep it a quartet, a performing quartet. So that's when the lineup was finalized.
Collins has said that Fripp was not in a good place, was very unhappy, and left him to do a lot of the the initial auditioning, sort of filtering out the chat.
Yeah. There was quite a bit of desperation when, for the second time in a year, they found themselves without a lineup. They thought it was a never-ending doom, or I mean, the band was looking like it was over. So yeah, there was a bit of pessimism.
In the wake of Poseidon had sold very well, like the debut. Lizard had sold quite well, but not as well. So there was a sense of what has happened to this band in the music press.
Yeah, it didn't look like a hot band. I mean, by the time they did Island, ELP, yes, were becoming really successful, and King Crimson was almost becoming a second-rate band. They had to climb all the way back up to the top of the game. And when they toured the US in '71, they were opening for ELP, opening for Yes, or bands like that. So they'd lost a bit of time and a bit of their status on the scene.
Now, this lineup toured probably more than any of the prior ones. Am I right?
Yeah, because it lasted, about a year, most of which was indeed spent touring. Again, nothing in Europe, except for the first gig they did, which were in Germany, at the Zoom Club in Frankfurt. But that's the only continental touring they did. There was no single King Crimson gig in France until '73, or in Italy, or anywhere in Europe. So they played mostly the UK, and then they did a couple of US tours in '71 and into '72.
Interesting. And this album is yet another one that's unlike any other in the catalog. I mean, I kind of consider it kind of like Lizard. They both are so unique and different from everything else that they are kind of in their own little world. I almost think of them as kind of a pair, maybe because they follow each other, but they both have these really expansive symphonic angles. much more so than just a mellotron playing strings or horns or whatever. There's
Yeah.
more going on than that.
There's a
And
jazzy vibe as well. I mean, Keith Tippett and the horns as well. So and they're both studio projects because that album, most of that album doesn't even sound very much like the live band that recorded it. A lot of it is based on Tippett's piano, which they didn't have on stage. So it's really a mixture, still in what Fripp called the interregnum, which was the transition period between the original band and the '73 band, in the sense that it was rooted in a studio vision for the band rather than a reflection of what they were playing on stage.
Now, am I right that the perception of this lineup has improved with the releases of a lot of live material over the last 25 years or so? Because originally all we had was the very muddy sounding Earthbound album to judge them by. And I
Which
don't
was
think,
the sort of vinyl equivalent of Revenge Porn at the time, I think, because Fripp was really released it as sort of a proof that that lineup wasn't going anywhere. And there's a couple of embarrassing jams involving Boz singing ad lib, which I can't think Fripp thought was really worthy of releasing, except for embarrassing the other members who had left. So it was really not a nice document. Although there are some great, I mean, the Schizoid Man on that is great. Sailor Sail is great, but it wasn't meant as a way to honor that lineup.
yeah,
So what came much later, like 25 years later, with the Lady of the Road album and then some releases on the Collectors Club, was much more of a celebration of that lineup as a real
yeah.
fine band.
I think it's called Summit Studios. Was that
Yeah,
the lineup? That's excellent.
yeah,
And that really shed a new light on this lineup all of a sudden. It's like, wow, these
yeah.
guys were much better than history is trying to paint them.
And Fripp did a whole CD on Ladies of the Road of just solos by him and Mel Collins. So I think for Fripp, what was really nice about that lineup was how he loved Mel Collins playing. And of course, they're reunited now in the band. And I think there's a lot of mutual respect there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, it's a very unique album. A friend of mine likened this to a fine brandy, where you put on your smoking jacket on a rainy afternoon and pour a little brandy and just enjoy it. Very rarely, but at special times. And I think that's a good way to put it, because it's
so it's important though to note that we lose Sinfield at this point. He's
true.
involved in the album, but those tensions between Sinfield and Fripp finally lead to his departure. Before that last round of touring, Sinfield then ends up becoming a key part of Emerson, Lake and Palmer, writing lyrics on a lot of the later ELP material, and so we end up with ELP having two original members of King Crimson, while King Crimson only has one original member. And we've also skipped over McDonald and Giles, who
let's go back. Yeah, let's go back and talk a little bit about ELP and that as well.
So McDonald and Giles leave. They do an album together in 1917, and it's got a lot of other King Crimson-y people involved. It's Pete Sinfield's involved, Peter Giles is involved. Bits of it were written for King Crimson and played in King Crimson, as Aymeric mentioned earlier. And I love it. I think it's a great album, but it's interesting because you see these different bits of King Crimson, like going to ELP, Fripp and Sinfield continuing, and you can sort of see the ingredients they made up in the Court of Crimson King, and they don't always work when you take them apart. So in the Court of the Crimson King, it felt a revolutionary album, whereas McDonald and Giles, love it though I do, it almost feels dated by the time it comes out. In some ways, it's a quite 60s album in what is now the 70s.
Yeah, still very much infused with psychedelia, like the cover conveys it. I mean, it's as far removed as the Schizoid Man cover as you could possibly think. It's two men in love who left King Crimson because they wanted to be with their loved ones. So very, very romantic. And the music itself is quite poppy. I mean, there's a Beatles vibe that is completely missing in King Crimson, and also some almost jazz rock jams. So it's quite a large range of material, and it's as you said, a great album in its own right. Although a bit weak on the vocal side when compared to Greg Lake's lead vocals. I think they're both excellent backing vocalists, but on an album, I mean, it's great that there's a lot of instrumental stuff on it as well.
And then, in contrast, the first ELP. Few
With
thoughts?
the song King Crimson Turned Down, Lucky Man, because Greg Lake brought it to King Crimson because it's something he wrote as a 15-year-old, and King Crimson didn't want to play it, and so that ended up on this. I think Take a Pebble might have been on the cards at one point for King Crimson. Maybe it existed in some form, but of course it's so shaped by Keith Emerson's piano part for it that it's hard to imagine it as a King Crimson piece, but it seems to have been intended for it.
So, after the lineup dissolved for Islands, how much of a gap was there before he finds the Larks Tongues lineup?
Before the Islands band has even dissolved, we're beginning to get the music that comes next with Larks Tongues and Aspic. So there's a couple of Larks Tongues and Aspic tunes that we know began with the Islands band, but perhaps they're not really fitting with what the Islands band is doing. The Islands band falls apart. Wallace and Collins stay in the US at the end
Alex's
of the
Corner.
Yeah,
I think all three of the others actually stay with Alex's Corner for a while.
and Fripp is left to rebuild again. Is this the third time? But he's got the beginnings of a very different style of music. He's I'm going to start backwards. I'm going to talk about Bill Bruford first, although in fact I think he joined the band. He was one of the last ones to join. John Anderson of Yes had guested on Circus, and Yes had been very impressed by King Crimson, and they'd asked Robert Fripp to join to replace Peter Banks, and Fripp said no. That would have been an interesting alternative history. But one thing King Crimson does is it gets Bill Bruford, who feels he's gone as far as he can with Yes. So he joins King Crimson. We get John Wetton, who's an old friend of Fripp's from Bournemouth. We then get the two perhaps lesser known members of the band, Jamie Muir and David Cross. Jamie Muir had been in a number of bands which we don't have much record of. So I think Jamie Muir was in Sunshine with Sunship with Alan Holdsworth. Yeah,
well, Holdsworth was only briefly in it, but he had Alan Gowan in it, and a guy called Laurie Baker was the prime mover behind it. But before that, he was in a band called Boris, which is when he came to the attention of Richard Williams of the Melody Maker, was good friends with Fripp, and it was Richard Williams who told Fripp about Jamie Muir because he was sort of on the improvisation scene. He was a sort of up and coming percussionist
and
worthy of attention.
And there's no recordings of Sunship. Are there any recordings of Boris?
No, there's sort of related recordings that came out on a collection by Laurie Baker that do feature Jamie Muir. He's also on an ECM album by the Music Improvisation Company, which is sort of Derek Bailey, very sort of hardcore free improvisation. But Boris, unfortunately, never made a recording. It became sort of the band Major Surgery.
Before we go any further, I want to go back and talk a little bit about the cover for Islands. Do you have any idea why it's the one album that has two different covers?
The cover art in the UK is Sinfields.
One on the right.
and the US label didn't like it, and so that image was inside the LP in the UK.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sinfield is on record as saying, you know, he saw Islands as very much his album. I mean, he was saying Lizard in a way is the pinnacle of Sinfield's vision, but he had a lot of role in Islands as well. And Fripp has been very critical of Sinfield and this idea that Sinfield was that Islands was Sinfield's album. But one way in which we see this is Sinfield doing this cover art that then the US label didn't like.
Well, Fripp didn't like the fact that Sinfield claimed as his own what was basically a photograph of a nebula. So he was credited for it, although we simply chose the picture. So it was a bit another dispute between them, I guess.
Well, it's certainly not obvious. You know, I mean, they didn't put an island with a palm tree on the cover. That wouldn't have worked for King Crimson anyway. You know, islands in space, I guess, is as close as we're getting to that. Okay, back to Larks. So this new lineup.
So I think
ball
Henry
of
was.
wax. You know?
Henry was going to talk about David Cross, I think, because you were.
Yeah, where did they?
David Cross, this great violin player. I mean, this is a you sort of get the impression. I don't know if this is true or not, but Fripp has he's had to recreate King Crimson. You know, King Crimson's constantly collapsed underneath him, and he's sort of casting around for a direction to take it in, and he almost seems driven by events as much as by vision. Whereas here, it feels as though Fripp has an idea, and he's going to put it together, and maybe he takes a bit more time to do that. And it's a very different sort of lineup, you know. So he's got a violin player, he's got two drummers, or Buford in a sense as a drummer and Muir as the percussionist, and he's got a vision for the music that sticks in a way that we haven't seen with the previous albums. But what did David Cross do before King Crimson, Aymeric?
He was in a band called The Ring, and that band was trying to get a deal with EG. So I think it was David Enthoven who told Fripp, "I'm going to see this band rehearse. Please come with me and see if you find them interesting. I'd like your advice on whether to sign them or not." And Fripp, I don't think he thought much of the band except for David Cross. So initially, there's an interesting conflation of perhaps two different projects here. One was to recruit Bruford and Wetton, and the other was to have a sort of Indian-style trio with Muir and Cross. That was abandoned, but I don't know if Fripp immediately thought of Cross and Muir for the new lineup, or if that just became one project out of two that were going to take place separately. So in the end, it ended up being that, and of course the fact that Cross brought violin to King Crimson was very new after saxophones and flutes were the order of, I mean, apart from guitar, was the main soloists. So that was, in a way, bringing King Crimson back to Europe and the sort of Bartok-Stravinsky line of musical lineage, as opposed to the influence of Black American music through saxophone and jazz.
I think that's a real important thing to point out. You know, a lot of the music on the first four albums was blues based. I mean, there's a lot of what we call a 1-4-5 in the early catalog. That really was driven home when I saw the Schizoid band play live. It was just like, wow, a lot of these are just a 1-4-5 done up with fancy riffage. But it seemed like Fripp started writing from a different angle by the time Larks came along, and these really dissonant, you know, skronky moments that you think of when you think of King Crimson, you immediately think of these muscular, dissonant, mean kind of sounding chords, and I think this is where that started to blossom. You know, tunes like Larks Tongues #1 and 2, both are full of
Well,
these.
also, we've gone from Fripp being the main composer on In the Wake of Poseidon, Lizard, Islands. Ian McDonald's credited on Cat Food, but I think otherwise everything's, all the music's credited Fripp, to this new lineup being much more involved as well in terms of the writing.
Yeah, a lot of the songs are based
improvising.
on Wetton ideas. Wetton, Palmer James. So Richard Palmer James is the new lyricist. John Wetton's old friend and a writing partner, also original guitarist and lyricist in Supertramp. That's an aside. But yes, as Henry said, a lot of the song material now comes from Wetton. Is usually co-signed by Fripp, because Fripp sort of crimsonizes all of John's song ideas.
Sure.
But
Book of
basically, you've got
Saturdays.
the Fripp instrumentals and the Wetton songs, with some input by Cross as well, who wrote the main melody line for Exiles.
Yeah, it's a new ball of wax here, and one of the most revered in hindsight. You know, this lineup was many people's favorite, and it was a vehicle for lots of improv, as the Great Deceiver box showed us very early on. You know, that was a big part of this.
If you listen to the very first recordings by that lineup, which is the Beat Club, they actually did a 40-minute improv. So the peak of their sort of crazy improvising was really in the beginning. By the time they did what is heard on the Great Deceiver, it had become quite a more reasonable sort of chunks of improv, more like 10 minutes. But initially it was completely wild. They were playing those at least an hour of improv, of full improv every gig.
And they're building material out of the improv. You know, they're taking good improv ideas. Those crop up again and again in some of the improv pieces, and then they morph into composed pieces. And also, though, increasingly there's this mix of using live improvisation and studio material.
Yeah.
Any highlights on this album for you, Aymeric?
I would say perhaps the first track, Larks Tongues Part 1. So you see the contrast between this, which is credited to the whole group. So as Henry said, it has its roots not only in Fripp's ideas, but in a lot of jamming, whereas the Part 2 is credited to Fripp, probably with some input from the others. But this first track is more a collective creation, and that defines the direction the band is taking. Of course, there's some nice songs as well, Exiles, Easy Money, but probably my favorite would be the first piece.
Mm-hmm.
It's very aggressive music. It's going back to the aggression of In the Court of the Crimson King, although it's very different sounding. You can hear links between this and Briar King Crimson, but you know, if this album had not gone out under the King Crimson name, I don't think anyone would have been surprised by that. It sounds quite distinct, although clearly the King Crimson name was still commercially valuable, and thus it made sense to do that. It took me a while to fall in love with Larks Tongues and Aspic as an album. You know, it was one of the first prog albums I heard, and I didn't get it back then. But it's a glorious album, and I think it's more indulgent, if that's the right word, than where this lineup goes by the time it gets to Red, which feels more focused. But it's glorious in that way. You know, these very slow build-ups of some of the pieces, and until it ends with this oppressive repeating riff of Larks Tongues and Aspic Part 2.
Yeah, that makes me think. You pointed out that a lot of these build kind of from nothing to a roar, and the Larks Tongue #1 is a great example, just starting with these little thumb piano kalimba pieces, and then it builds into a these huge monstrous riffs. And the talking drums, another example where it just kind of starts as the wind blowing and grows into this screaming banshee climax that leads into Larks number 2.
And that's not something, the other prog bands were doing at the time. Islands and Lizard, as we've said, are feeling like they're sort of falling behind what your ELP or Yes are doing. But Larks Tongues and Aspect feels like a jump ahead.
Yeah, he's forging new ground.
And the one band it makes me think of is Godspeed You Black Emperor, a much more recent post-rock band who have that similar.
That thing where they'll all start playing one note very quietly.
Yeah.
10 minutes later, it's the same note, but 10 guitars are playing it very loudly.
Yeah, it's like a 40-minute talking drum.
Which is taking it a little to the extreme. Crimson would build up, and then they give you a lot of fireworks, but Godspeed never really offered fireworks.
No. Well,
a little bit, but
I'm clearly more of a Godspeed fan than you are. Or a Silver Mount Zion you could listen to, but we're getting off track. Yes. I mean, I think it is also important that you do also have these wettony songs.
Well, sure, it's kind of like Cadence and Cascade or I Talk to the Wind. It provides that balance.
And I think Wetton is so not to get ahead of ourselves, but Wetton, he goes from King Crimson, he's in UK, he's then in Asia, which for many people at the time was seen as this great betrayal of prog. This commercial, very successful band, putting out hit singles, and later in his career, Wetton does, a variety of solo albums. He does acoustic tours. What I find interesting is that when you listen to some of those latter Wetton acoustic versions, his King Crimson songs and his Asia songs and his UK songs kind of actually start to sound the same. The Wetton song hasn't changed a lot. It's the context it's in that has changed, and so that Wetton song in the context of King Crimson with Fripp doing all of these things around it produces a very different effect to that Wetton song when it's Jeff Downes in the 80s making an Asia song. But in a way, Wetton's writing, I don't think actually changed as much as we sometimes think.
All right, so the departure of Jamie Muir. What's the story behind that?
Well, we have to remember Jamie Muir inspires Yes to do Tales from Topographic Oceans.
What was the story behind that, briefly?
So there's a wedding. Whose wedding was it?
Bruford's.
So at Bill Bruford's wedding, Jamie Muir gives a book to John Anderson, and it's in that book that he finds this footnote about the 4 Shastras in Hindu mythology, which inspires Tales from Topographic Oceans.
The book is the autobiography of a yogi by Yogananda or something, an Indian writer anyway. And it becomes, as Henry says, the inspiration for Topographic Oceans, but for Jamie Muir himself, it's a much more profound effect, which leads him to abandon music and retire in a monastery in Scotland for 7 years after that, with no music, and he doesn't return to any sort of music activity until the 80s. So that's why he leaves, although at the time it is said that he hurt his ankle or hurt his foot during a gig at the Marquee Club, but that's an excuse made up by the management.
Well, at least he didn't break it roller skating with Richard Branson.
And
no, that's the better story.
And what does he do in the 80s? When he returns to music, he makes an album with Michael Giles.
Yeah.
Of all people.
Well, we'll have to seek that out.
Yeah.
It's fantastic, but
that's
fairly tricky to come by last time I remember looking.
Yeah, what was it called? Do you remember?
The Ghost something with David Cunningham, was it?
Yes.
It was the third guy.
I can't remember what it was called. Ghost something.
Yeah. It was on voice print at one point. Said
So
to be the tip of the iceberg of a lot of recordings they did but never released. That's from Sid's book as well.
so he's out of the
Ghost
picture,
Dance.
and they carry on as a four
Mhm.
piece.
With Bruford adding a whole percussion set to
That
his
whole
drum
rack
kit.
behind
To
him, I'm sure,
Yeah,
was inspired by Jamie.
yeah. So that's when Jamie left that he started having this and jumping from one to the other. So the spirit of Jamie Muir was retained to some extent
Yeah,
by Bruford doing both percussion and drums.
Bruford has always been full of praise for Muir and Muir's influence on what he did.
Yeah, he really opened his mind up to a lot of possibilities that I don't think he had considered.
Yeah, but in a blunt way. Apparently, Muir was quite frank about what he didn't like about Bruford's playing, which was probably the proggy, yesy aspect of his playing. And that, in that way, by criticizing him quite bluntly, it did produce that effect on Bruford. But I don't think it was initially said in a very nice way necessarily. It was a brutal reawakening for a guy who may have thought at the time that he was on top of the world, being the drummer with Yes. And that was a lesson in modesty, and Bruford learned a lot from it, which
It's
is
a
a
good lesson
testament
to learn.
to his intelligence as well.
The album was called Ghost Dance, the
Yeah.
Jamie Muir album from the 80s. So keep that in mind. So the next album was basically, it started as a live affair that was overdubbed in the studio after the fact. Maybe not every track, but most of them. Am I right?
No, basically they didn't have enough material for the album, which was being planned for recording in early '74. So they decided, because they wouldn't have time to create enough new material, they decided to take a sound engineer on the road and record a few gigs professionally. And at the time, they were realizing that they were doing some really good improvisation on stage. So they thought, we're going to record our gigs and use some of the written material from those gigs. So Fracture was a live recording with a few other dubs on the album, but about a third or half of the album is completely improvised. So that's what they did. They recorded gigs and then went into the studio to record some studio material on top of it.
Yeah. Well, this was famously released as the Night Watch back in the 90s. Maybe the
Yeah,
next release
yeah,
after
yeah,
the maybe the next release after the Epitaph box. It was
yeah.
one of the early ones, and that was quite compelling because it's not radically different. They overdubbed a few things and fattened a few things up, but it's the live fracture on there is not radically different from what you get on the album. And this is a piece that has been getting a lot of attention lately, thanks to a gentleman named Anthony Garone from Make Weird Music, writing a book about his 22-year journey trying to learn and play the song Fracture, which is, it has a very unique picking pattern that is unique to Fripp. And he struggled with it for years. He was capable of playing Dream Theater and lots of other technical music, but until he went to Guitarcraft and learned to rethink his approach to his right hand, it was not doable. And he said he often tried to just force it into shape through brute force, but it was defeating. So once he went to Guitarcraft, you know, he was enlightened and soon had the ability to play it, and then wrote a great book about it called Failure to Fracture, which I highly suggest. It's a wonderful, colorful coffee table book with exciting illustrations on every page. So it's, it isn't just a dry slog, with no visual accompaniment. It's really quite compelling on a few different levels. So I suggest checking it out.
It's an album I think sometimes gets slightly lost between Larks Tongues and Red.
I
Red in
agree. I think this album is a little more demanding to take in. So so I think maybe that's one of the reasons it isn't quite as popular, because it's a little denser, a little more menacing. It's just a little harder to decode, I think, at first. Um, the opening,
I have
great.
to say
Yeah.
it might be my favorite of the three though, because I love the mixture of written material. I think the songs are really good on that, and Wetton is really growing into his own as a singer. And of course it has Fracture and some really good improvs like
Well, yeah, I
Trio.
mean, Fracture is the piece. I would have to say that is the pinnacle of this era when it comes to complexity,
Yeah,
you know. And it would definitely inform later eras of King Crimson, especially the Construction of Light era, which basically picked up some of those pieces and elaborated on them. You know, the follow up Fractured, you know, there aren't a lot of follow ups in the catalog unless it's called Larks Tongue, and then there's several. But those are, other than that, no, not
And
many.
I think it's an album where we truly also see the band coming together as equals. It this period for me, it stops being Fripp's band. You know, part of Fripp's genius often in King Crimson is bringing in other people who then have very significant creative input as well. You know, so we have these periods where King Crimson is very much dominated by Fripp's writing, and then we have these periods where Fripp identifies great people and also gives them room that he doesn't like. He's not an Ian Anderson and Jethro Tull where he's writing anything. This is the band where everyone is contributing to the writing and to the improvising.
Yeah, probably for the first time since the first album.
Yeah,
honestly. And the opening of The Great Deceiver is quite a aggressive piece. Um, and am I correct that Fripp had visited the Vatican gift shop, and that was what inspired the lyrics about you could buy cigarettes, ice cream, and the figurines of the Virgin Mary all in one spot. You know.
yeah, that's his one lyrical contribution to King Crimson. That line, the rest was Richard Palmer James, but the line stuck, and it was
Yeah.
indeed on when they were touring Italy in '73. Actually, the date here is should be '74 really, but a lot of it is recorded in '73.
Well, it's quite an exciting piece, and I hope the current lineup dusts The Great Deceiver off. That's my request, Robert.
I haven't heard them play anything from that album because they were playing Fracture on the tour in 2016 when I went to see them in Italy, and they stopped playing it the night before I saw them and never played it again in my presence.
Well, as you know, it's one that even Robert has to work on for several months to get it ready.
Yeah,
And
3 hours a day, I think I read.
yeah, and some days, you know, it just doesn't feel right. You know, it takes everything. Like Anthony Garona pointed out, it's a very athletic piece of music. He goes, you know, it's one thing to play Starless, you know, it's quite another to play Fracture. So, you know, just have to be in the right headspace and physically feel up to it and just all those factors. So sorry you missed it. I didn't see it either, but I saw, you know, there's some footage that was on
Yeah.
YouTube that was quite stunning. I mean, you know, this lineup is quite capable. And in some ways it was more dense than it ever was, you know, with all those
Yeah.
different parts and stuff. So great record here. Now, what happens lineup wise next? Is there a falling out with
David Cross drinks too much.
Oh, shh.
That's not the official version.
Fairly well known at this point.
I don't think David Cross denies it now.
Oh yeah. Well, I think is I mean the official explanation is more of a musical nature in that it became sort of a hard rock band with Wetton pushing the volume up a lot, and the violin just didn't cut it live at the time with the means of amplification available, and so he ended up playing a lot of mellotron and with a bit of that electric piano on top of it. So he became more of a keyboard player, and he was seen as the weak link, especially by Wetton, I think. at the time who thought maybe a different fourth man would be a better ally to conquer America.
Although Fripp's not defending him either.
No, it's only Bruford is really loyal to is against his dismissal.
Playing violin with a loud rock band is one of the hardest things to do, especially in that age before there was in-ear monitors and all that. You know, I mean, you're just hung out to dry if the volume gets too loud. And I think there's actually, you know, live documentation of this happening to Cross more than once.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, Cross leaves King Crimson, and then it sort of goes into obscurity for a period, which is a great shame because in more recent years he's come back as a fantastic player. He has his own David Cross band, who are quite crimson-y, but with modern tech manage that violin against rock band sound.
Yeah,
but he's also done some great improvised albums with David Jackson, with Andrew Booker, with Peter Banks.
His Exiles album was a really excellent.
Yeah, in the 90s. It had both Wetton and Fripp as well as Peter Hamill on it. So, and he did a new version of Exiles on it.
Yeah, that tune with Peter Hamill is something else. I forget what it's called. Thonk or has some weird name like that. And yeah, man, he's, you know,
a lot of these fallings out that we've talked about, you know, through the 70s and King Crimson, happily people made up much later in life. Fripp and Sinfield made up. Collins, of course, ended up back in King Crimson many years later. Bands can be areas of high emotion, and it's good to know that after a bit of a break, everyone can be friends again.
Yeah, that's great. You know, I can't say that's true with every other prog band out there. There's other ones that never look back. So I think we're almost done. We're finally reached Red. Now, was Red basically done as a trio with some augmentation from Mel Collins and such?
And Ian MacDonald primarily.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it was done as a trio because they hadn't yet found a fourth man. But I don't think if they toured with it, they would have remained a trio. So basically what you hear on the album is either a second guitar augmenting the guitar, or Ian MacDonald playing alto sax, or Mac Cherrig playing trumpet. So it does show a trio on the cover because it's the sort of the link between all tracks. There's a live track with David Cross even on it, but he was not involved in the recording. He wasn't asked to be there. So it does have a more rock power trio kind of vibe to it, but with additional soloists as well.
Yeah. Well, the title track, I think, has become a legendary piece for a lot of reasons, and it had a big influence on a lot of the math rock groups that we are familiar with from the last 20 or so years. And just the approach to, you know, King Crimson has a way of taking dissonance and making hooks out of it. You know, it's like, this song is all about the nasty rub of this bass playing E against the guitar playing more B flat things of tritone away. So it's almost like as dissonant as you can get, but it's really catchy anyway, you know. So it's
kind of tritone blues.
Yeah, you know, it's in a way, along with your whole tone, not whole tone, I guess kind of more of a diminished kind of scale, I think, that leads into it, the opening bit. Yeah. Octatonic, that's the one, the 8-note scale. That's, you know, that's one of the scales that pops up quite a bit in this era of Crimson, along with whole tone, which is a scale that has no half steps. It's all whole steps. That's basically the basis of most of Fracture. Is the whole tone scale, along with the bit with the xylophone in the middle. That's more of a Lydian flavor. So yeah, interesting vocabulary and how it expanded and really informed every other lineup down the road.
Yeah, it's interesting because it was that title track is in a way the precursor to the 80s band in that it's a more minimalist kind of influence. And actually, Bruford originally rejected the track for being too simple,
Well, I
which is
remember he
why
said
Fripp
it's
decided not to let Bruford have any part of the songwriting revenue from it. Although, uh, King Crimson, even the tracks that were signed only by Fripp during that period, the royalties were shared four ways in any case. But on that track, Red, he said all the money is going to me because you were skeptical about it being even good enough for the album.
well, he said it
So that's
sounded like the old standard T for two.
yeah.
Well, that's not exactly a compliment, I guess.
Yeah. So that's the one track that really departs from the previous direction. The other two songs on side A, Fallen Angel and One More Red Nightmare, are more a continuation of that direction. And then the second side is interesting because it has one last goodbye to the David Cross lineup, with David playing some really, really nice violin on it. And then Starless, which is kind of a way to close the chapter of the first album, although they didn't know it while recording it, but it sounds really like a return to the original direction. It does have Ian MacDonald playing an alto solo in the style of the first album. It has the mellotron all over it, and it has this English lyrical side to it. So it's a perfect closing track to that era, but it wasn't recorded in that spirit, so it's all the more fitting and sort of wonderful for it.
Why do you think this album is regarded so highly?
Well, I guess primarily due to those standout tracks, Starless and Red, which are among sort of hits by Crimson standards,
Red
classics.
Nightmare is worth mentioning as well.
Yeah,
I think that opening riff is just brutal, and working some more whole tone kind of scales angles there.
yeah,
And then of course Bruford's ratty sounding cymbal that he found in the trash outside the studio is legendary. I mean,
yeah.
you know, how much, how famous is a broken cymbal? That may be the most famous broken cymbal of all.
It
So
does feel like in some ways, like a distillation of where this band is going. The shedding of Muir and Cross to some degree, although Cross is on one track, to produce this power trio, which maybe makes it slightly more accessible in some ways.
I think you're right. Yeah, I think so. And this basically was the last album, Fripp dissolved the group for, all intents and purposes after this.
So Robert Fripp decides he doesn't want to do this anymore. And as Jamie Muir goes off to a monastery, Robert Fripp has his own interests that put him away. This is when he's getting into Gurdjieff.
Yeah. Although there's a full year before he actually goes there. He does the tour with Eno, and he puts together the Young Person's Guide and the USA album. So he finishes the ongoing business before he actually does that. But he has this vision just before recording Red, actually, of impending doom, so to speak, and he doesn't feel prepared for the future. So he decides that he's going to retire from music. And during the whole recording, it doesn't voice an opinion. So it ends up with basically Wetton becoming the de facto producer on this. And it's Wetton who calls Ian MacDonald and perhaps Mel Collins as well. The choice of guests is very much down to the others. And by the end, Fripp is ready to concede that he's going to do at least part of the tour, but then says, I'm going to leave after a while. They still haven't decided who's going to be the fourth man. There was discussion on several violin players. Eddie Jobson was discussed. A guy called Will Gibson from Centipede, and who plays also on Island, who leads the violin section on Island, is thought to be a potential candidate. He ends up joining the Electric Light Orchestra instead. And eventually Ian MacDonald appears to be the fourth man. And Fripp says, "Oh, that's great. That way I can leave the band after the first leg of the tour, and there's still going to be an original member in the band." But then the management decides against it. It says, we won't support the band if you're not in it anymore. So that's when Fripp says to the others, "Well, the band is over because I'm not staying for a full tour."
Well, it's interesting that this happened right at the peak of progressive rock. I don't believe that was what inspired these choices, but the timing was quite good because in a way it's nice that Crimson closed up shop rather than, we've seen their peers grapple with the oncoming 80s.
Wetton and Bruford didn't think so. I mean, here they are having huge creative success in this band, and Fripp pulls the rug from under their feet completely.
Oh, I can understand their disappointment.
What Wetton and Bruford do next, though, is interesting. They try and work out some way of continuing the magic. There's an attempt at a band with Rick Wakeman, who's not at that point in Yes, called British Bulldog, which management issues seem to get in the way of. Then Fripp suggests a reunion, and there is a plan for a new band with Eddie Jobson, who we've mentioned, on violin, and there's going to be a new King Crimson with Fripp, Wetton and Bruford back with Eddie Jobson now as the fourth man. And then Fripp pulls the rug from that, but this time they keep going, and they recruit Alan Holdsworth, and that becomes UK. And in many ways, UK is a direct continuation of what this King Crimson lineup has done. It's this King Crimson lineup without Fripp and with Jobson. It's different in some ways, but in many ways, you can hear a very direct musical link. There's a stronger musical link, I think, between this King Crimson and UK than there is between this King Crimson and the next King Crimson or the previous King Crimson.
Right.
Yeah.
Which
perhaps we should
have to save for our next episode.
Yeah. I wanted to say a few things about what Fripp said at the time Crimson ended in '74, because there's this whole thing about dinosaurs. And he gave some very interesting interviews around the time King Crimson folded, denouncing the way the music business was going, with bands becoming dinosaurs. And there's been sort of a revisionist view about what he said at the time, even endorsed by him, that he was criticizing prog as a musical style in those interviews, when in fact he was simply pointing to the music industry becoming more capitalistic and resting on its laurels, really. And he wasn't, I mean, there's nothing in those interviews that points to prog as the main culprit of that. It's really about famous bands becoming lazy and complacent.
Well, true. And I don't think anybody could really put their finger on the whole essence of prog in 1974 anyway. People weren't even using that word that way, I don't think, at the time. It's almost revisionist history that has shone that light on it all these years later. That prog, the word prog was almost a prison that King Crimson has been trying to break out of for decades.
Yeah. Well, if you listen to some stuff on Fripp's Exposure album, you can see the direct continuation of Red in Breathless and pieces like that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So he hasn't given up on the concept.
That's the important bridge between Red era King Crimson and Discipline.
Yeah.
Although I think it owes more to Red than it does to Discipline.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, anything else you guys would like to share before we wrap it up? We actually did this in 2 hours. I'm quite impressed.
A lot of discipline on our part.
It's interesting how King Crimson goes from this band of 5 great players to Fripp's band, and to Fripp trying to, in effect, give it away almost at the end, or almost not wanting the responsibility of of having to support the name. So it's an interesting journey, but at the end, Fripp cannot divorce himself from King Crimson, and the rest of the history of the band, you get a sense of Fripp more in control of events as than perhaps he was in that post in the Court of Crimson King period, where he's thrown from crisis to crisis almost. But it is a magnificent journey, and that's what I think makes a band like King Crimson so interesting. And you can say the same maybe for a Yes or a Gong or a Henry Cow, that there are such shifts as well as continuities in the music.
Certainly. And then Discipline, which we will touch upon in our next episode, that was intended to be a completely new band. Fripp wasn't trying to resuscitate King Crimson for the 80s. It was, so it's not unlike Yes, when they got together and started a new band called Cinema, and then the record companies got involved. It's like, you could sell a lot more records if you called this your old band's name. Yeah.
I mean, I think that becomes a dominant theme as for many bands, that the record company is always wanting the established name because that's what sells. Because ultimately, as music fans, we're often conservative, and we're often not willing to try new things.
Something new, right?
Go back to established name.
Well,
and Greg Lake is one of the people, and Keith Emerson also, who sort of have these very depressing stories of how whenever they did something, the record label would be, "Oh, Keith, why don't you get Greg to sing on this? Then we can call it ELP." And then the way that the band name becomes a cage,
yeah. Well,
of expectations. Although King Crimson often very successfully, as we'll come to next episode, has the name, but doesn't feel any responsibility in a sense to play the old music or stick to that style. So King Crimson as a name becomes attached to some very different musics going forward.
I have to add as a teaser to our next episode that actually it's a bit more complicated than that, whether King Crimson was intending to call itself King Crimson when it reformed in 1981. The King Crimson Discipline story is a bit more complicated than that. It was going to be King Crimson until Fripp decided he wasn't sure, and then he was sure again. So
it's another one of those cases where Fripp has his version of the tale that he's been very successful in getting out there, where he talks about it was going to be something else, and then I felt the spirit of King Crimson had re-entered. When no, but that's yes, we must save tales for
that's right.
those two.
So to be continued. I would imagine we will do this episode sometime in August. So
Midsummer Night.
And I'll definitely have a date for y'all once it gets a little closer to scheduling August. So, all right, gentlemen. Well, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure. I thoroughly enjoyed our trek through the Yes catalog, and I was like, well, what adventure could we try next? And King Crimson seems like a great place to go, especially with the tour coming and all that. They're going to be on the front burner in many people's minds. So this is a great time to stop and talk about all this. And again, we are by no means the sole word on this stuff. If you want the final word, I suggest buying Sid Smith's wonderful biography or History of King Crimson, whatever the book is called, I forget now. So
always lovely to talk to both of you.
Yeah, always a pleasure. I'm glad to see you guys are doing well, and I hope you have a great summer until we speak again.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Looking forward to next time.
Okay, and I will be back next Saturday chatting with Derek Shulman about the new Freehand remix done by Mr. Steven Wilson. And we'll also touch on some other subjects as well. I'm itching to talk about London in the early days and Simon Dupree and all of that. So you know, we've already done a very extensive Gentle Giant interview last year with Derek, where, like he said, I grilled him for 2.5 hours and covered just about everything you could ever want to know about King or Gentle Giant. So we won't be treading over that again. We're going to go some new places and lightly grill Derek this time, you know, just little grill marks. All right. All right, y'all. Take care. It's always a pleasure.
Look forward to it.
See you all soon. And if you have yet to subscribe to our channel, it's /Soul, SOAL, Night Live at YouTube. All right. Take care, y'all. I will see you soon.
Bye-bye.